A very good afternoon to all of you. Myself Amandeep Kaur. Today I am here to make your presentation on the database connectivity in VB.NET. So before we going to with the introduction with the ADO.NET, we are going to cover ADO.NET, the benefits of ADO.NET, ADO.NET core concepts and their architecture, and the architecture will include ADO.NET object model, the data sets and the data views, and the managed providers. Before we start the ADO.NET, what is ADO.NET? The connectivity of the database with the Visual Basic or VB.NET. First of all, we should have a little light on the relational database. Means what is the database, how we make the database available to the languages. So the relational database is a database or a collection of database which is organized into the tables. The table consists of rows and columns. Then we said the collection of rows and columns are known as the data. Each row represents an instance of an entity. Like one of the entity shows the one of the instant of the data. Each column represents an attribute of an entity. Every column is known as the attribute, that is the all the information related to all the entities of same domain. Then there is the metadata. Metadata describes each table column, like the information about the data. Then there comes the relationship between entities are represented by the values stored in the columns of the corresponding table. For describing the data, we should have one model so that this model describes the logical view of the data and the graphical representation of the high level entities. For example, there is the microbial databases. Each organism has multiple corresponding genes. So it will be defined by the one to many relation, means every organism can relate to many of the genes. Many of the genes can be used to make the one organism. So one entity is belonging to another entity by the many of the genes. So this is the model through which we are describing the data. Then comes the metadata. Data that describes the properties or characteristics of the other data is known as metadata. It does not include any sample data, means it does not include the examples. It includes the definition about the data. This metadata allows database designers and users to understand the meaning of the data. So there is the other concept is relationships. Relationships are the idea or the logical dependence or interdependence between the data. These relationships are used to connect the tables, fields that have same value in the related tables. For example, organism.accession is equal to genes.accession, means the two columns organisms and genes, they are belonging to the accession table. So this accession should have the attributes which are unique, means the value is not repeated after the one after the another, and the unique attribute is known as the primary key of the attribute. That means that value of the attribute, the data in the primary key field will not be repeated, otherwise that field will not be a key. So genes is not a unique entity and it is the secondary key. So it is not a primary key, so we make it as a secondary key. So these are the relationship. Either if the data is unique, the values are not repeated, then we said this is the primary key. But if the values are repeated, there is the redundancy of the data, then we said it is the secondary key. Then there is a one language in which all the data, all the queries are described and through which we can connect the even data to the databases. That is the SQL. We said SQL, SQL. This SQL is constructed by or developed by ANSI, that is the American National Standard Institute, this standard computer language for accessing and manipulating the database system. So these SQL statements are used to retrieve and update data in the database. This SQL includes data manipulation language, that we can update the data, we can delete the data, we can insert the data, we can modify the data, and the some of the DDL languages, that is the DDL languages, that means we can define new tables, we can define new rows, we can modify the structure of the table. That means we are defining the structure, we are defining the length of the databases, type of the databases through the DDL commands, and DML commands are used to modify the content of the data. Then we should have some through light on the DML commands, the syntax for executing queries, updating, inserting and deleting records are: first is the select command. This select command extract the data from one or more table. Like if we want to take some data or view some data from the table, like in the student database, I want to see the data of database of the one of the any college students, then I can simply put the select query. If I want to insert some new database into the table, then I have to use the query insert into. This insert into help us to insert new data into the table. Then there is the update command. This update command is used to update the data in the table. For example, one of the student has changed his address, he shifted from Mumbai to Jalandhar, then we have to update the database, then we can use the update command which includes in the DML. Then there is the delete from. Suppose somebody left the college or left the organization, we want their delete their data from the table, then there the command is delete from. It helps to delete the data from the table. Then there is the DDL languages. This DDL data definition languages is the syntax for creating, editing and deleting. It helps us to create databases, edit databases, delete databases, tables, views. Views are the nothing but one form of the one instance of the whole table. Views, indexes, constraints. Constraints are the nothing but the conditions that we are applying on the data so that the particular data can be extract, particular conditions can be applied on the databases. Then the users, then the privileges, etc. Next comes the, here now we will start the ADO.NET and .NET framework. Here you can see you all have learned the CLR .NET framework. The .NET framework includes Microsoft .NET framework, which this framework help us to use the web services, all the services which are provided by the webs, like it help us to search, it help us to mail the data, it help us to search the data, etc. And the user interfaces are the nothing but these are the user interfaces which help us to interact with the data, interact with the web data, server data. Like if there is a good interface, any non-technical person can also use the or read the data. Then there is the data and XML. XML is the form of the or you can say the compromised of the HTML, which help or which have the how the data may be expressed. Next is the ADO.NET. ADO.NET is a set of computer software components that programmer can use to access data and data services based upon the disconnected datasets and XML. So this ADO.NET help us to access the web services or web databases. It commonly used by the programmers to access and modify data stored in the relational databases systems. Through it can also access data in non-relational resources. ADO.NET is sometimes considered as the ActiveX data objects. So, the main function of the ADO.NET is to extract the data from the databases, from the relational databases, etc. So, for this we are using the base classes and the common language runtime. As we all know, common language runtime is the software which convert the data into the native code, or which can be easily executed by the .NET framework. So, let us start with the ADO.NET overview. ADO.NET is a collection of classes, interfaces, structures and enumerated types that manage data access from relational data stores within the .NET framework. So, all the classes, interfaces, structures which are defined in the .NET framework, and this ADO.NET help us to extract the data from the relational data sources, and these collections are organized into the following namespaces. For example, system.data, system.data.oledb and system.data.sql client, etc. Means SQL data is you are accessing the data, systems data, which is stored in the your system in the form of tables. Then system.data.oledb means your data based on your databases, and your system SQL client means help us to access the communication between the clients and server computer. So, these are some of the namespaces which are already defined in the SQL language, so that you can access the data or retrieve the data from the relational databases. So, ADO.NET is an evaluation from ADO. It does not share the same object model, but share many of the same paradigm that functionality. So, ADO.NET is basically a managed provider, means this is the provider. What it provides? The data. From where it provides? It provides the data from the databases which are already on your servers. So, this managed provider merges the ADO and OLDB into the one layer, and each provider contains a set of classes that implemented common interfaces. That means it provides you an interface which help us to access the data in the set of classes. Like it help us to access the logical view of the data, means it provides you the data as you required, as you say in your query. Like the initial managed provider implementation is helped by, like ADO managed provider provide access to any OLEDB data sources, and the SQL server managed provider provides optimal performance with SQL server, means when you are doing the SQL server client communication. Server client communication is when the client is requesting any data from the server, then this SQL server managed provider is so managed that we can access the data so easily. That it is also have the quality of exchanged managed provider. That is, it retrieve and update data in the Microsoft Exchange. So, it is the valid programmer of the Microsoft, and it provides us the very managed data to the sources. Here you see the architecture of ADO.NET, that how it provide. See here in the first, it is your application, like you are writing any software, your code which is requesting for the databases from the servers or any relational database. This is the ADO.NET managed provider. This ADO.NET managed provider take your query and send it to the SQL Server databases and OLE databases provider, which help us to retrieve the data from these two databases and provide back to your application. This is the simple structure that how ADO.NET works. Then there are some benefits of the ADO.NET. The first is interoperability through use of XML. This open standard for data that describes itself. This is the human readable and decipherable text. That is, it does not contain any technical language that will not be understood by the non-technical person, as well as it contains the simple English like language, but it can also contain the decipher text, that it do not include any encoded language. It contains only the English type language which can be easily readable by or understandable by the person. It used internally but accessible externally, but we are using it internally, but we can access the data from the outsources also. For example, it can use XML to read and write and move the data. Next is the scalability through the disconnected datasets. The connections are not maintained for long period. Databases log does not occur. That means the locking cannot be done, but the locking support with services component, that is the obstetric locking otherwise. It works the way the web work, hit and run. Like you access the website, you just write down the address and you view the page. In the same way, in the through the ADO.NET, we can access the data from the server, from the web, easily, like simply writing the query, you hit and take the data from the services. Maintainability is very easy, like you have the separation of data logic and user interface, so you can easily maintain the data. These are the benefits of the ADO.NET. Here you see the core concepts and the architecture, like how this ADO.NET works. The ADO.NET object model includes objects of system.data, means the main object through which you can access the data is the system.object. .NET data providers. Now these .NET data providers help us to provide the data. Then the namespaces which we mainly used with the ADO.NET are system.data, system.data.oledb, system.data.common, system.data.sql client and system.data.sql types. System.data is used when we access only the data simply from the relational tables, and OLEDB where the data is in the database of form. Then common type data when we use the sharing of the data. Then the SQL client is used when we are communicating between the client and server. Then last is the SQL type when we have to define the data types in the data. Here you see the more of the namespaces which the ADO.NET include: the SQL types, SQL client, common and the OLEDB. The first is ADO.NET data provider. The data provider is a collection of classes for accessing data sources. The Microsoft SQL Server 2000, the SQL Server 7 and MSDE, these are the basically main data providers. Any OLE databases provider includes Oracle, JET, the SQL database provider. Means these are the software through which we can easily provide the data or use them to access the data. This is established between data sets and the data stores. The two .NET data providers are ADO and the SQL. ADO via the system.data.oledb and SQL by the system.data data.sql client namespaces. So these two namespaces are respectively used with the ADO and SQLs to provide the data. Here is the hierarchy that how data will be provided by the .NET framework to us. For the SQL client, the first comes the command, then the connection, then data reader, then data adapter. Means before when you put any query for the data, the first of all you set the SQL command that I need to access the any data. Then OLEDB command will be go to the server side, that connection is established, that there is the command for establishing the connection, both of the side, SQL side and the database side. When the connection is established, then we read the data, then we give the acknowledgement for the data, we take the data and we adapt the data. Here are the some general steps for using web databases, that how we can use the data, we can extract the data from the database or the web databases. First of all, build your database table and queries. Like you register any of the website, it will take your it will ask you to fill any form that you are building the databases. It is going to be stored somewhere. So create a connection to the databases. When the database is built up, we have to maintain the connection, that how we can retrieve the data from the table. That will help the connection identifies the location of the databases, the data sources and the connection method. An ODBC driver, the OLDB provider and the OLEDB.NET data provider along with any of the other settings such as username or passwords. Once the connection is established, then you have to create the web page using the ASP.NET. Then you have to create your data forms, that the interface through which you can make the data or form the data, build the data. Then add an ADO.NET connection object that connects to the databases, execute commands and return data from the databases. Then last is create a code that will interact with the data, display the data in an ASP.NET control, perform calculations on the data and upload changes to the databases. I am repeating. First of all, you have to build the data using the tables and queries. Then you have to maintain a connection with the .NET framework using the OLEDB providers. Then you have to create your web page like any of the language like Java or ASP.NET etc. Then add the ADO.NET connection object that helps to connect the databases and execute command on your database. Then this form, or you can say your web page, help us to interact with the data, display the data in the ASP.NET control. So first is to make the connection, there are some commands like the connection is used to talk to databases, means you have to set the properties. In the left column there are some properties column, you have to set the properties like data sources, username, password, then SQL connection and OLEDB connection. You have to maintain the connection between these two. Then you have to run the commands which help us to extract the data or retrieve the data, like SQL statement or stored procedures in the PL SQL. That SQL commands and the OLE database command help us to retrieve the data, like you have to extract the data. You said select table this from that table name, where conditions or constraints you have to apply it there. The data reader, it will help to read only data or forward only view of the data of ADO record set. That the data set main object of the data set are the main object for database access. Data view, this is the filtered view of the data set, means whatever the constraint you are applied, that I need the data of those students who belong to Chandigarh, that they will filter you the data according to the city and you can view only the data of the Chandigarh city. So these are the view you can create by filtering. Then there is the data adapter, which means the initializes of the data set tables. Here are some introducing the objects, which what are the objects which are used. The first is connection. For maintaining the connection or making the connection to and managing the transaction against the table database, means first of all you have to maintain the connection to and managing. Then there are the commands. These issuing SQL commands against databases. Then there is the data reader. This data reader for reading a forward only stream of data records from a SQL server data sources. Then comes the data sets. Data sets are the raw data or the data for storing, reporting and programming against flat data, XML data and the relational database. These are the types of data through which you make the interface, or these are the interaction, you can make the interaction with the databases. Then there comes the data adapters for pushing the data into the data sets and reconciling data against a database. Then there comes the introducing the objects. Here you can see this system.data contain the main classes of the AD data. The main class of the AD data is system.data. This is the main class in which data set is the cache memory or in memory cache of the database, the frequently used data. That comes the data table. This data is the in-memory cache of the data table, means the frequently used table which are used by the AD.NET. Then there is the data row, which is used to manipulate a row in the data table, means one of the record. Then comes the data column. This is used to define the columns in the data table. Then there comes the data relation. It is used to relate two data table to each other, means using the referential integrity, using the foreign key concept, we can use this data relation. That comes the data view manager. It is used to create view on the data sets. So system.data namespace contain the basis and the bulk of the AD. So this is the main class of the AD.NET. Here is the OLEDB connection and SQL connection. It represents a unique session between the data source. It creates open, closer connection to the data sources, functionality and the methods to perform the transactions. Here you see the example of the OLDB connection. This is the strict constraint. It provider is equal to Microsoft.jet.oldb.4.0. It provides the path from where you can access the data, plus data source is equal to new ind_row.mdb. So it make available the data using these addresses from where this data is stored. So help us to extract the data. Then there is the OLEDB connection. So this is for maintaining the connection is equal to new OLEDB connection constraint, and a code is equal to open, means executes the query using the OLEDB data adapter. It initializes the data. That comes the data connection properties, means for maintaining the connection, what are the properties you have to set. The first is SQL server name. You have to give the name to your server, and the default name of the MSDB version of SQL server is machine name \netstk. This machine name is the name of your local computer from which you are accessing the data. It is also referred to as local_net.stk or local host. It is not required in the connection string assumed to be the SQL server if it uses the SQL client class. Then comes the data sets object. A data set object represents a cache of data with database like structure such as tables, columns, relationship and constraints. The dataset can and does behave much like a database. It is important to remember that dataset objects do not interact directly with databases or other source data. It allows the developer to work with a programming model that is always consistent regardless of where the source data resides. The data coming from a database, an XML file, from code or user input can all be placed to the dataset objects. It makes the changes made